One. So we were talking about the Canadians in the First World War, and we got to a point where the Beaumont Hamel was about to happen. Joining me today for a little while, my buddy Oliver, the History Cat, is here. He's going to stick around for a couple of minutes while we talk about this. So the Battle of Beaumont Hamel is going to be fought on July the 1st, 1916, and this is the first day of the Somme. And this is going to result in devastating losses for the Newfoundland Regiment. Oliver's going to go now. Say goodbye, Oliver. This is going to result in devastating losses for the Newfoundland Regiment. You know, everything that could go wrong on this day in the Somme goes wrong. And, what we see here is we see poor planning. We see a failed aerial bombardment. We see total miscommunication between the regiments. The Newfoundlanders are in a trench line called St. John's Trench, and an order comes through that they're supposed to leave St. John's Trench. They're supposed to go over the top into no man's land in broad daylight towards those German defenses, those German machine guns that I've talked about. And, this plan was bad already, but what was going to make it worse is they'd fired artillery at these machine guns, and they'd hoped to knock the machine guns out. They hoped to knock out the barbed wire, the minefields. They failed. They totally failed altogether. So when those Newfoundland soldiers started to move forward, they're in exposed terrain, and they're not going to get very far, okay? I've been to Beaumont Hamel, and I've seen where the St. John's Trench is, and I've seen where the German position was, and that in itself took me, a good 15 minutes to walk there. So yeah, they're not going to get very far. They get to a place called the Danger Tree, and this is kind of the last point they got to, and this is where a lot of them are going to be cut down by enemy fire. So they're down on the ground. They're taking cover. A lot of guys are injured. There's one story of one of these soldiers. It took him 3 days. He was shot 3 times to make it all the way back to the Allied trenches. He survived, which is great. But most of this regiment is going to be annihilated. So on July the 1st, 801 men were in the Newfoundland Regiment on the day at Beaumont Hamel. July 2nd, they show up for roll call. There are only 68 left. And, they gain nothing for this. It was really this tragic symbol of sacrifice. That's why even today on July 1st in Newfoundland, the rest of us are celebrating Canada Day with barbecues and fireworks. They have that as a Memorial Day of honor. So, almost entire villages of young men in Newfoundland were wiped out. It is one of the biggest sacrifices that were made in this war. So the Battle of the Somme is going to continue on throughout that summer, but in late August of 1916, the Canadians, who had now gotten the name the Byng Boys because of Commander Julian Byng, or General Julian Byng, they were kind of sent out. They were told to go to the muddy fields of Flanders. And, this is here in the Somme section too. It's a different part of it. And they are given the task of holding that front line in Flanders. And, they're going to run into very heavy fighting. And this was supposed to be a pretty quiet area. Okay, they called it a normal sector. And the result of this is they're going to suffer some 2,600 casualties before the full-scale offensive even got underway. So that main offensive begins on September the 15th when, the Canadian Corps are going to go on to assault a sector in the front lines at a village called Crochette. Now they're going to advance using something called a creeping barrage. They're trying this out. Basically, what you have is a line of artillery fire. The men follow behind it. It actually allows you to get pretty far along. The other thing that's going to be helping the Canadians out here is there is a new weapon that they're trying out here. This new engine of war was called the tank. And this threw the enemy into complete confusion. I mean, can you imagine seeing a tank for the first time? It would be like seeing a dragon or a shark coming at you. Um, so the Germans really didn't know how to counterattack this new weapon. So the attack went well. And by 8 a.m., the main objective, this position known as the sugar factory, was taken. And the Canadians are going to push forward. Now the Germans are going to counterattack, and they're going to be successfully repulsed, held back by the Canadians. And by the next day, we held that position. Now the Germans, they did bring up reinforcements, and the fighting is going to intensify. Sorry. But the gains that are going to be made by the Germans are really kind of microscopic. So, as we're going into the fall of 1916, the Canadian divisions, the three of them then, were attacked again and again and again by, the Germans, and they in turn attacked the German positions as well. Now, our final objective is something called the Regina Trench. This is a great strategic location. If we can get this, it's definitely going to hinder the Germans' war effort. And we had tried time and time again to capture it, and it really hadn't worked out for us. What we end up seeing here is, like the Canadians are not going to find success. And by mid-October, we had gotten close to that Regina Trench, but we weren't able to take it. So what ends up happening is those three divisions of the Canadians moved out, and actually a fourth division is going to take its place in the line. And it's going to, these poor guys are showing up here, and they're going to face this ordeal. They're going to be in knee-deep mud, and they're going to face violent enemy resistance. They're just starting out here in the war, and it's already kind of this living hell for them. Now, despite this, on November the 11th, 1916, the 4th Canadian Division, we capture the Regina Trench. And it's not what we thought it was. It's really kind of just this mere, depression of a trench. It's nothing really worthwhile having. A week later, in the final attack of what comes to be known as the Battle of the Somme, the Canadians, we advanced to another trench called Zimmer Trench. And this is a remarkable feat of courage and endurance. It's really hard to take it. Nobody expected us to, but we did. And the Canadians took that position. And, soon after that, they're relieved, and they're going to join the other Canadian group at a place called Vimy Ridge. So 1916 ends really with no real advancements at all that year. Like there's some, but it's nothing really major. That autumn, it rains, and it turns the battlefields of the front lines into a bog, and you can't really run an offensive. And both sides kind of have to halt everything. So the line had been moved forward by the Allies about 6 miles. The Allies, for the Battle of the Somme, they're going to suffer 600,000 casualties. The Germans are going to lose 236,000. This is a staggering number of people. Like, the Germans, they call the Somme Das Blutbad, the bloodbath. And even us Canadians are going to suffer 24,029 casualties. But here, the Canadian Corps got this reputation. We are hard-hitting shock troopers. The Lloyd George wrote, the Canadians played a part of such distinction that therefore they were marked out as stormtroopers. For the remainder of the way, they were brought along to head the assault in one great battle after another. So, we got this reputation as being this force that you can rely upon, these stormtroopers. A matter of fact, this reputation is going to make its way over to the German side as well. Whenever the Germans after the Somme heard that the Canadians were coming, they prepared for the worst. They really kind of recognized that, the Canadians were a force that could definitely take them out. And it's going to be this reputation that the Canadians um, were trusted with the task of taking Vimy Ridge. And this is going to be a really key point in bringing this war to an end. And Vimy Ridge is, without a doubt, one of the greatest moments in Canada's history. And one of these really defining moments of the war. And we see all over the history categories. There was no other operation on the Western Front that has more thoroughly planned, than Vimy Ridge. This is going to be a frontal attack. It was considered to be virtually invincible to take Vimy Ridge. Um, you know, both the British and the French had tried numerous times and had failed. And, so the job came on to us. And in reality, we weren't expected to take the ridge. We were kind of there to be a diversion for a bigger British attack on the nearby town of Arras. But that didn't matter. The Canadians, we're going in planning to take this ridge. And the planning starts months in advance. The Canadian commander, Major General Arthur Currie, he did something that a lot of other generals really hadn't thought of. He said, and I quote, "Take time to train them." And that's what the Canadian Corps does. They're going to train, they are going to prepare for this war. And, everybody, every single soldier who's going to fight in this battle, every Canadian, they're going to know every aspect of, the terrain and the plan. So let's go back a little bit to the planning here. In the autumn of 1916, that's when the Canadians were moved out. That finished us off at the Somme. And we were sent over there to basically relieve the British troops at Vimy. And they're going to spend the winter, and it's a cold winter, strengthening the defenses that were already there. They're going to raid the Germans. That's kind of expected. They want to mainly raid here, though, because they want to gather intelligence, because Currie's got a spring offensive plan. So he needs all the information he can. Where are the trenches strong? Where are they weak? Where are the men situated? Where are the dugouts? So these are fact-finding missions. And, they're going to lose a lot of men in these raids. 1,400 Canadians will die in these raids. But the knowledge gain would make sure that later on, when the Canadians attacked Vimy Ridge, they weren't going to suffer the same way. So what did Currie do? Well, he had a full-scale replica of the battle area built, and it's laid out, with colored tape, flags. It shows, where everybody's positioned. This is back behind the Canadian lines. And it's here that the Canadian units would carry out repeated exercises. They're going to rehearse exactly what they were going to do on the day of the attack. And, maps are given out to guide even the smallest units. Prior to this, only the commanding officer would receive a map usually. Everybody's got a map. So the troops were fully informed about their objectives. They were told how you're going to get there. And everybody was expected to play their part. Timing is going to be key. As well, underneath Vimy Ridge is where we're going to see a lot of work being done. Underneath, they are mining. Like what's different about Vimy Ridge is you've got rock, unlike those trenches, which was all, sand, and this is rock here. So, we have engineers digging long tunnels underneath no man's land. And some of these tunnels are going to be filled with explosive charges to blow up enemy trenches. This is going to leave lots of craters in the landscape. But Currie is going to send in his own workers. And working at night, these groups of men who are tunneling, they are going to take the tunnels that the British and French had built before, and they are going to extend them. We're going to have a really deep network of underground tunnels here. They're going to call them subways. So in total, there are 12 different subways, and it's going to be about 5 kilometers in length. And it's here that, troops are going to be able to come out at different points on no man's land, and they get further up going underground. That's less men that are going to die. The other thing is the guys don't have to sleep outside. They can sleep deep underground. So when artillery shells are falling on them, they're safe and sound and dry. And it's actually pretty quiet down there too, so they can get some rest. I've been to Vimy Ridge and I've gone into those tunnels, and it's amazing. You go down pretty deep and everything around you is quiet. So, this is a real advantage. Also, in those tunnels, you could have things like hospitals, which could treat guys with, minor wounds to get them back to the front, or those who were hurt a little bit more, it could maybe stabilize them and save their lives. So, this is a really big and important part of what the Canadians were doing here. The tunnels were lit with electricity, so they're not going around with candles or anything. They also put telephone lines so that you could have constant communication. Currie recognized communication is going to be key here, and so they wanted everybody to know what's going on. Now, telephone lines had been used in previous battles of this war, but the problem is when they're up above ground in no man's land, artillery, are hitting the ground. It's going to break the lines. So the lines were not always the most reliable form of communication. That's why in World War One they often used runners, people to run back and forth between the trenches to share information. And of course, hopefully the most famous runner of World War One was a young soldier from the Bavarian Regiment by the name of Adolf Hitler. So, having those telephone lines underground is going to allow for greater communication. It's going to allow things to be shared from between different positions. It's going to allow for, if the Germans were to break through somewhere, they can shore up that area altogether. Now, what we end up having here is basically these caverns which could hold an entire battalion. We also end up having these other smaller caves here. Okay, they're called saps, and what they basically did there is they dug these really tiny tunnels as close as they could get to the German trench line. They packed them with explosives. Part of the plan is to blow out the German walls and surprise the Germans. I mean, you'd never expect the wall behind you just to kind of explode. And this is going to be a real advantage. So, in addition to these underground tunnels that are being done, Canadian and British engineers, they're going to repair 40 kilometers of road around Vimy Ridge. And they're going to add an additional 4.8 kilometers of a planked road. And on top of that, they're going to build a tramway, kind of like a train, that will go over 32 kilometers. And this is going to allow them to move men in and out fast, as well as supplies. Okay, those planked roads mean that the mud's not going to really be in effect here. It's going to allow us to get more people in, more supplies in, and get our more critically wounded out to field hospitals. So, we are ready for this attack. And what we're going to see is, the Canadians are going to kind of rev up to the main attack. And they're going to start to kind of, again, gather some information. So what the plan is they're going to start off by having this massive artillery attack. A barrage upon a barrage, and it's going to start on March the 20th. They've got 245 heavy guns and howitzers, and on top of that, they've got another 600 pieces of field artillery, kind of smaller things like artillery that can be moved around and fired at closer range. They want to kill as many Germans before the attack comes at Vimy Ridge. And the soldiers are kind of put into risk. So all this firepower basically meant that you've got like one heavy gun every 20 meters on this field, and one field gun every 10 meters. They again want to just pound out at these guys. Now, from March 20th to April 2nd, they're bombing, and on the 2nd they really step it up. And what we're going to see here is, by the time the attack actually begins, over 1 million artillery shells had battered the Germans. So, one Canadian who was there, he commented that the shells poured over his head into enemy positions like water from a hose. And more than 80% of the German guns had been identified by aerial reconnaissance. They were destroyed. Okay, so the Canadians, they had the biplanes flying over. They were taking pictures. They found out where German artillery was. That's what they're going after here. They want those Canadians to be able to come up through no man's land and not worry about getting killed by artillery fire here. So the Germans are going to call this the week of suffering. Their trenches are going to be shattered. Their artillery is going to be demolished. That barbed wire, which was key to your defense, is pretty much going to be gone. So the Canadians are clearing themselves this path up there. As well, the aerial combat is going to greatly increase at Vimy. So as I said, those planes are getting reconnaissance, getting lots of really great information about the enemy positions. The Germans, they know what they're doing. They're going to send up fighter aircraft to try to take out these reconnaissance planes, which meant that, we need to defend our planes. They are going to engage in a lot of dogfights, as well as they're going to fire anti-artillery shells. And here we see, probably the most famous of all of our Canadian pilots in World War I, a guy by the name of Billy Bishop. He's going to win the Military Cross on April 7th. And what he does is, the Germans would send up these balloons, and, this is supposed to hinder, the planes from reconnaissance. He's going to shoot down one of these balloons near Vimy. And this is kind of, a dangerous feat. It's kind of a starting point for his career and the legend of Billy Bishop. So the Canadians are ready for an attack. And at 5:30 in the morning on April the 9th, 1917, it's Easter Monday, the Canadians begin, and they're going to use that creeping barrage to move steadily to the German trench lines. As I said, you basically have a line of artillery fire kind of moving up the area of no man's land, and following behind are the Canadians. This is why practicing was so important, because you needed to be in line with that artillery barrage that's going on. You can't go too fast because you don't want to get caught in it. And if you go too slow, you're kind of missing the point of it. That barrage is clearing that path. It's sending debris and smoke into the air that's going to cover more of your assault, so the Germans can't see you as soon, and it's going to save lives. So, more than 20,000 soldiers were in this first wave attacking, from the 4 Canadian divisions. And, the Canadians, we are the ones who are kind of the lead there. There are other groups there as well to assist in this attack. But this is really kind of ours. And, the Canadians lead this assault. And what we end up seeing here is, the creeping barrage is going up. They're also, the weather's terrible. There's sleet and snow. But the Canadians know where to go. They had practiced this. They had gone through the reenactments, and what they're going to find is they're going across no man's land. It's devastated. They're picking their way through shell holes. They're coming across some of the earlier trenches that are shattered, um, you know, and they realize that they're not going to face the kind of resistance that both the British and the French had faced as they attacked Vimy Ridge in earlier attempts to take it. Now, each of the soldiers are going to carry, a heavy bag, 32 kilograms of equipment, um, you know, which is going to make it even harder because you also have to take into account, you've got this equipment, you've got mud all over you, and of course, mud is going to weigh you down. You've got, um, you know, weapons. Different soldiers had different other things that they had to carry into battle, and this is actually going to make it harder for the Canadians to get up into the German trench line. But they're carrying equipment because they recognize if they take the line, they've got to hold the German trench line. So they want to be ready to do that. Now, when we get to the German trench line, there is going to be some hand-to-hand fighting. But, the Canadians, they're prepared for this, okay? We're a pretty tough group of guys. And this is where we are going to kind of run into our strongest resistance. And this is where we're actually going to have a lot of losses. And it's those German machine guns. Okay, the German machine guns are still positioned in the intermediate line. So you've got numerous lines of trenches there. The German machine guns are still there. And this is where we face some real resistance. But we pushed through. They planned for this. They knew that these machine guns were there. And 3 of the 4 divisions, they meet their objective by the middle of the day, right on schedule, just as Currie had planned. And in the final stage, what we end up seeing is the 2nd Canadian Division, assisted by the British 13th Brigade, they're going to kind of hold that main trench line. Now, the Canadian 4th Division has, an objective. It's called Hill 145, and this was the highest and most important feature on the entire ridge. And once it was taken, its summit would give the Canadians a view of this area called the Douai Plain. They would see everything where the Germans were positioned. They would see how resources are coming in, and they basically see the other side of the trench line. The Germans recognize how important Hill 145 is, so they're going to set up really really heavily fortified entrenchments. They're going to put a lot of wire there. There's a lot of deep dugouts. And, they recognize just how key this location is. They're not going to give it up without a fight. The other thing that's kind of nearby is another area that was called the Pimple. And the Germans are kind of up on this area, and they're able to fire down. Like it's going to cause the Canadians to kind of have to fight from a couple of sides here. And that attack coming from the Pimple is, going to be very costly as well. The Canadians keep coming. Excuse me. The Canadians keep coming, and they keep kind of biting their way up there. They're going to renew their attacks. And finally, in the afternoon of April 10th, a fresh group of men would come in, and they would take Hill 145. And this is going to place all of Vimy Ridge under our control. It's still going to be a couple more days. 2 days later, the 10th Canadian Brigade, they're going to storm the Pimple. And at that moment in time, the Germans have to accept the losses at Vimy Ridge as being permanent. They know they're not going to be able to retake this ridge. They're going to pull back. They actually pull back a whole 3 kilometers. We are going to capture a huge number of Germans here. A matter of fact, we're going to capture so many Germans that later on they'll be able to do prisoner exchanges, and we're going to have extra Germans to trade down the line. Now, Vimy Ridge is going to be this significant success for the Allies in that spring offensive in 1917. And although we won this really great tactical victory, the Canadians were unable to exploit our success quickly. We weren't able to break through the German lines at that point, mainly because the artillery is going to get bogged down, and it's not going to be able to be moved up to a place where we'll be able to fire down in that Douai plain, over that 3 kilometers. So recognizing that, what the Canadian artillerymen did, they actually moved up to what was left of the German artillery, and they had been trained to fire this, so they're going to use that, but we don't have the same amount of artillery as we had if we were able to move it up there. So without a doubt, the success of Vimy Ridge is because of the planning and preparation, and what Currie really wants to do, and Byng as well as part of this planning, but Currie wants to minimize the number of Canadians killed, the number of casualties altogether. And this is going to be successful, as well as we have to give it to the individual commanders, the guys on the ground, and as well our soldiers. You have to remember, a lot of these guys, they're not career soldiers. These were citizen soldiers. They were people who signed up to come over to the war and fight for their king and country. And they look like the most professional fighting force that you could imagine. So at Vimy, the Canadian Corps is going to capture more ground, more prisoners, like I said, more guns than any other previous British offensive in the 2.5 years of the war. And it's probably one of the, if not the most complete and decisive engagements of World War I. And up until that point, it's our greatest victory. And we, again, as Canadians, demonstrated that we had one of the most outstanding forces on the Western Front. We were masters of offensive warfare. And, this is going to be something that the British are definitely going to look at, and in some cases learn from. Now, although the victory at Vimy was a swift one, it doesn't come without a cost. 3,598 Canadians are going to give their lives at Vimy Ridge, and an additional 10,602 casualties will be suffered. It was those battalions in the first waves which are going to suffer, the most. And, as Currie stressed, no level of casualties could ever be called acceptable. But, when we look here at Vimy Ridge, they're lower than the norm we had seen in other assaults. Think about it. 1916, that summer before, they had just had the Somme, where over 600,000 British soldiers had died. And here we are, taking Vimy Ridge, where we have 3,598 dying. So, this is one of these battles which we can look at and say, that good planning saved lives. Oliver the history cat agrees with me. Like, to put it into perspective, the British and the French, they had tried before, like I mentioned, to take it. And in those attempts, they're going to suffer about 200,000 casualties. So Arthur Currie deserves a lot of credit for this. And Vimy Ridge, taking Vimy Ridge, is going to really kind of be this moment in the war that has a turning point for the Allies. When the Somme ended, things looked very bleak for the Allies. See, he agrees still. Things looked very bleak for the Allies. But a year and a half after Vimy Ridge, the war is over. And, because of Vimy Ridge, we are not going to have to kind of sit in the back of the room when the Treaty of Versailles is being negotiated. We get a seat at the table. Okay, we're no longer colonials. Um, we are equals. And back home, the victory at Vimy is going to be celebrated, and it's going to unite Canadians, in pride at the courage that our soldiers had. And there are a lot of historians who say this is the moment when Canada went from being a colony to becoming a country. To put it into perspective, Brigadier General Alexander Ross, who was in charge of the 28th Battalion at Vimy, and he's witnessing all this. He is going to basically say it was in those few minutes he witnessed the birth of a nation. So Vimy is this crowning achievement for us. And we are going to be given even greater tasks as we move ahead. The next place that we're going to be kind of heading to is a place called Passchendaele. And following the victory at Vimy, we're going to first of all stay in the Arras area, to divert attention from the French front. As well, we're trying to conceal from the Germans the big planned offensive in Flanders. So the Canadians are going to kind of stay in that area, and our big battle is a place called Hill 70. This battle is going to take place between August 15th and 25th, and we're going to capture a really strategic position in the northern approach to the French lines there. We're going to capture the city of Lens and secure the western part of that city. This is not going to be as good an outcome as Vimy was, because the Canadian Corps is going to lose 9,198 casualties. And you'll notice I'm always giving the number because we need to remember those men who gave their lives for our country and for our freedom. Now, although the losses, which are never acceptable, were huge, they're able to gain considerable ground. And this is going to stop the Germans, in fact, from sending fresh troops into that area of Flanders. Not everything is going to go great as well. So the French are running an offensive at a place called Lorraine, and their leader is a guy by the name of General Neville. It's a disaster. The French are going to lose about 200,000 men, and you actually have a wave of mutinies where a number of French soldiers are like, I'm leaving. It's not worth it here. And this is really going to kind of take the French out of the war in a lot of ways. Earlier in July, the leader of the British, a guy by the name of Sir Douglas Haig, he's going to launch this really poorly planned drive into Flanders. He wants to break the front. What his objective is if he can break through, he wants to go to Belgium where the German submarine bases were. When you take out those German submarines, it's going to open up the shipping lines. A lot of material was coming from Canada, and by that point, the United States is selling stuff too to the war effort, and those U-boats are sinking a lot of ships. So if you can take out that base, it's going to help overall. And they kind of start off really well in June, but we end up having weeks of delays. In the second and main stage of the attack, Haig orders a massive artillery barrage, and the Germans knew it was coming, so they're able to kind of dig in and not lose the number of men that the British had hoped that they would lose. As well, is what we end up seeing here is the battlefield itself is going to be filled with potholes and dust, and then rain starts, and what we're going to see is rain starts coming in coming the very night that the offensive began, and this is going to turn this entire area into this impassable swamp. So as the British soldiers struggled in this swamp to try to get through, the Germans are going to just sit there and they're going to inflict a huge level of casualties. Okay, like their German machine guns are just going to pick off the soldiers as they're trying to come through. And the Germans were really smart. They had positioned what are called pillboxes along concrete boxes where the soldiers firing the machine guns were very well protected. So over the next 4 months, here Flanders is in Ypres province where the Canadians face gas for the first time. There's no real advances being made. And by the time we get to October, the main objectives are still controlled by the Germans. And the British forces had reached a point where they're exhausted. They've been throwing men just at the German lines. Although his other generals are telling him to stop, Haig wants to try one more offensive. And, this is when he sends in the Canadians. The Canadians are sent in there, and our job is to capture what's left of the town of Passchendaele. Now, Currie had inspected this muddy battlefield, and he went out there. He knew the Canadians were going to go there, and he protested. He's like, this is going to be impossible to take. It's going to cost us a lot of men. And he's like, I'm predicting at least 16,000 men will die here. And Haig and the other generals overrule him, even though he warns them that this is going to be so bad. So Currie does what he did at Vimy. He starts to plan and prepare. Now, unlike Vimy, you can't use the creeping barrage when you've got a swamp there. The whole idea was to send debris up into the air, to send dust to shield your soldiers. Here, artillery shells hit that mud, it cradles them. They aren't going to explode. So he has to approach this in a very different way. So what he decides to do is he's going to create a series of attacks. It's smaller offensives to kind of move your way up closer to the German lines. So the Canadians are going to go in on October the 26th. 20,000 men are going to be under heavy, heavy machine gun fire, and they're going to fight their way from shell crater to shell crater. These poor guys, they're muddy, they're soaking, they can't get supplies in, but they keep pushing on. So on October the 30th, 2 British divisions and the Canadians begin the assault on the town of Passchendaele itself. And they get to the ruined outskirts of the village during this very violent rainstorm. So you can imagine already there's this swamp. Already it's all muddy. They've been fighting, and now you've got more rain, more water pouring down on them. This rainstorm is going to fill what's left of the shell holes and what you could maybe call trench lines. And for 5 days, the Canadians are going to sit in this waist-deep mud, and they're going to be fired upon by the Germans. Okay, the Germans are going to fire tons and tons of artillery. It's exploding above. You've got chunks of metal coming down, shrapnel's raining down on you. They dig in. What they're waiting for is reinforcements. And on November the 6th, the reinforcements had arrived, but already the cost had come into play, whereas 4/5 of the attackers who initially went in on that attack were dead. And sadly, when the battle was over, Currie's estimate of 16,000 casualties, it was right on. There were exactly 16,000 Canadians killed. Passchendaele, although we do count it as a victory for the Canadians, was really kind of a disaster. And as we go into the end of the war, there's going to be more to come. So we're going to stop there right for this one. And when we look at the last part of the war here, We're going to see how the Canadians bring it home. We're going to look at what's going on at home. We've talked a lot about what's going on in Europe, but there's a whole other world back in Canada that's kind of facing the war in a different way. So, as for now, take a moment, when you get to the next November 11th, take a moment to be silent, to remember these guys who died at Beaumont Hamel, who fought, on the Somme, who were in Ypres, the guys at Vimy and the guys at Passchendaele, the ones who are going to give their lives after, because they did that for us. They did Canada proud, and we owe them. We need to do them proud as well. So with that, this lecture is history. See ya.